Okay. I'm just checking, make sure my microphone is live. I'm good? Okay.
Yeah, it's the software's, I got these triggers built, and sometimes they work and
Sometimes they don't. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Daniel Barth with another How Do You Know program brought to you by Explore Scientific. And this week, we're going to talk about everyone's most and least favorite rocket, the Artemis 1 launch system that NASA is going to use to take astronauts back to the moon. And you probably all know by this time, we had this set up last week, but we don't usually do a How Do You Know program on a bank holiday Monday. So last week we had the Labor Day holiday, so we skipped a week. But I feel like this is still very topical and right up to date for you. NASA has now failed to launch on a couple of attempts with the Artemis 1 rocket system. And a lot of people are concerned. What's going wrong? What's wrong with Artemis? Well, we have to realize that manned space exploration is really, really difficult. Space is a notoriously difficult environment, even if we talk about robotic exploration of places like Mars. Less than half of the launched Mars missions from all the world's space agencies have successfully reached their destination. And NASA is no stranger to failure there, nor are the Russians, nor the Japanese, nor the Europeans. And we've all had our struggles. And getting to the moon is notoriously hard. We recognize that we, the United States, sent men to the moon in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And when we did that, this was the first time it ever had been done. And in fact, when we initially launched the rocket, most of the astronauts knew it was basically a coin flip, 50-50, whether they would come back or not. They were on a brand new system. No one had ever done this before. And after we sent the last rocket in 1972, most of us who were alive back then and watching, as well as most of the astronauts in the program, were all convinced, okay, we're going to develop the next launch system and we'll be there in 75 or 76. Matter of fact, it took us just 7 years from the first moon landing to get us on Mars with a spacecraft the size of an SUV. We thought, wow, if we can put a lander on Mars in 7 years, we're going to be going back to the moon really, really quickly. In fact, that didn't happen. And for many political reasons, very few scientific ones, but many political reasons, we didn't do that. For years, we had the space shuttle, and the space shuttle was a low Earth orbit vehicle. It had a maximum altitude of about 350 nautical miles and rarely went that high. Most of the time, it was in much lower Earth orbit. Now, when we tried to launch the Artemis rocket, our return to the moon, Congress, when they authorized the program, said, let's save money. And certainly, if I'm in charge, and you can remember in November, Barth for Emperor, I'll solve all these little problems for you. Don't write that in, y'all. But when we're talking about Congress, they said, let's save money. And so they mandated that NASA must reuse as much as they could from the space shuttle program. So they're coming in and saying, okay, we're going to mandate that you reuse as much as possible from a 40-year-old rocket program. Ask yourself, if you're Ford, GM, Hyundai, Toyota, Honda, and the company head comes in and says, let's reuse as much technology as possible from 1980. Is that going to be a win for you? Absolutely not. It won't meet emission standards. It will not meet crash standards. It's not going to be fuel efficient. It's going to waste a whole lot of research and development that's going forward. And yet, Congress are not rocket scientists. I know. That was a shock to everybody listening. But they said, no, we need to reuse this technology. And questions come up about, why did we do this? Well, here we run into the realm of speculation, but things we do know. There's a lot of very established companies who have lobbyists who contribute lots of money to political figures, and they would like to keep making rocket parts, which are very high profit. And now that we've been doing it for 40 years, heck, this is a no-brainer for us. No research is required. No new tech is required in terms of a factory. And so we can just keep cranking out the same parts. Was that a motivation? I don't know. You'd need some sort of a special congressional investigator to find that out, and I'm not that fella. But we do know that the space shuttle, known as the STS, or Space Transport System, they averaged at least one scrub, one postponement per launch. So in all the years it was operating, about 20 years it was operating, and they averaged about one failed launch per successful launch. Some of them had as many as 5 scrubs before a successful launch. And so you look at this and say, wow, can you imagine going to the airport? You're going to fly from Dallas to Los Angeles or New York to San Francisco, or you're just going from Madison to our local XNA airport here in Fayetteville. Can you imagine an average of one postponement per flight? The public would be howling. They would be writing letters to Congress and screaming, like crazy people at the folks who run the counters for the various airlines. Nobody would be happy with that. And yet we were taking this system with an average of one failure per success. And we're saying, let's reuse a lot of the parts. And the culprit was often the same. The culprit, friends, was the liquid hydrogen fuel system. So why do we use hydrogen in the first place? Hydrogen, friends, is a really, really energy-dense fuel. I've experimented with hydrogen as a fuel before, and there were experiments that we did teaching physics with methane as a fuel, and we had access to some hydrogen, and we said, oh, let's try that. And my class and I was frankly completely unprepared for the energy yield of hydrogen, which is fantastic. It is such an energy-dense fuel, but it's not an easy fuel to work with. Unlike kerosene, diesel oil, gasoline, liquid propane, hydrogen is very difficult to work with. To start with, hydrogen is a very tiny molecule and very low molecular weight. Why does that matter? Well, when we have fuel, we need to keep it in a tank. And if we talk about something like liquid propane, gasoline, kerosene, we can keep these in a plastic container, we can keep it in a metal container, and we put it in there and it stays. Now, nothing is perfectly non-porous. Even if you're talking about a fabricated steel or aluminum tank, say you talk about the steel wall tank that you have for liquid propane on your backyard barbecue. Well, that's a formed steel tank. That tank is not completely non-porous. But all that's necessary is that the pores have to be smaller than the stuff you're putting in there. If you have a kitchen sieve, something you use to rinse vegetables and pasta, if you put a bunch of marbles in your kitchen sieve, the marbles are bigger than the holes, and that sieve is non-porous. No marble is going to fit through the little holes punched in your aluminum kitchen sieve. Pour a bunch of sand in, and that sand will all leak out because the sand particles are smaller than the holes in the sieve. A steel tank, an aluminum tank, a plastic tank, doesn't matter. They all have porosity. And hydrogen is such a tiny molecule that it can percolate through materials that most of us consider to be completely non-porous. The second thing, why do we use hydrogen? It has the largest energy yield per kilogram of fuel. Remember that hydrogen molecules are very tiny, so a kilogram of liquid hydrogen contains a lot of hydrogen molecules, many more than you would have in a kilogram of liquid propane or butane or gasoline or kerosene, by many orders of magnitude, because the hydrogen molecule is so tiny. Well, hydrogen is also cryogenically stable. It's stable at very low temperatures where it's a liquid. And we want these low temperatures because the hydrogen as a liquid becomes denser, and the energy yield per kilogram and per cubic meter of fuel becomes even higher. And so there's a lot of reasons why we like hydrogen. It's relatively easy to compress and cool it into a liquid. But we have to be careful, because where hydrogen liquefies at about 20.3 kelvins, it goes solid at 14 kelvins. So you have about a 6-degree window. Lighter than that, warmer than that, the hydrogen starts to boil. And in boiling, it increases the pressure by a great deal. That's bad for a sealed containment system. If you get 6 degrees colder than the liquid point, it goes solid and it will no longer flow through pipes and valves, etc. And so you've got to have a fairly narrow window, but we've found we can do that. And what are we talking about with 20.3 Kelvin? We're talking minus 252 Celsius. For you Fahrenheit fans out there, minus 423 Fahrenheit. So 20.3 Kelvin is 20 degrees above absolute zero. We're talking a very, very cold system. So,
Question.
yes.
Look on your screen, you'll see these flu twitch.
Okay, why not keep it solid? Okay. I suppose it would be interesting to explore using hydrogen as a solid fuel, like the solid fuel boosters on the space shuttle. But I suspect as solid fuel boosters burn from the bottom up, that heat's going to transfer and start boiling the hydrogen gas. I suspect with hydrogen as a solid fuel, you can't get a reliable flow rate out the rocket nozzle. I'm expecting that as you heat that up and start the burn at the bottom, the flow rate would increase exponentially, and you'd essentially have a bomb instead of a rocket. And the margin between bomb and rocket is fairly fine. And that's why rocket science is hard, y'all. And it's if you look at the early history of rocketry, we succeeded in making a lot more bombs before we made successful rockets. And in fact, when Robert Goddard, the father of modern rocketry, proposed liquid fuel rockets, people said, oh, that won't work. A lot of people were like, even the New York Times and prominent physicists said, oh, that can't work at all. In fact, they were wrong. Goddard was right. So we talk about this problem with hydrogen permeability, and we come along and we look and we say, well, because of permeability, we have unique problems. When we pressurize a tank with liquid hydrogen, it starts to leak immediately. And it's a matter of we need to fill it up, light the rocket, use up the fuel before too much leaks out. And you think, well, hydrogen's a very light gas, it just floats away. But if your liquid tank is inside your rocket body, you're concentrating explosive hydrogen as a gas inside, which is not a good thing. And cryogenic hydrogen liquid hydrogen, if you've got a liquid which is 450 Fahrenheit or 250 centigrade below zero, that's going to cool your metal fittings by that much. Metals, when they are cooled, they shrink. We have contraction due to cold and expansion due to heat. This is basic science we all learned in 6th grade. We all know this. And yet if we're talking about, we need a connection to a rocket fuel tank where we can pump fuel in and fuel that rocket in a relatively short period of time, and once it gets filled, we want to pretty much ASAP, as the NASA boys say, light the candle and go. We do not want the rocket to sit fueled on a pad. That's not safe. It's not practical. And in fact, if they decide to scrub the launch, the first thing they do is start to pump the fuel out of the rocket because it's very dangerous. The other thing we realize, because there's leakage all the time, we're constantly putting a little more fuel in. It's like topping off your tank. You know, you go to the petrol station and you top your tank off a little bit, you squeeze the nozzle a couple more times. I can get another little bit, I can get another half liter in there. And we all do that with our automobiles. But when we do that with a rocket engine, realize it's not like a nozzle that fits in a hole in a tank. It's actually physically connected to the rocket. It has to be a relatively firm, very firm and secure connection, because otherwise the hydrogen just leaks like crazy, and hydrogen mixed with air is explosive, and that's really, really dangerous. We've all heard of and maybe seen footage of gas explosions where natural gas leaks into a house, and then there's a spark and the house becomes a bomb. Hydrogen is explosive at lower concentrations, and it yields many times more energy than natural gas. So you're talking a big danger if you let hydrogen gas accumulate. So when we have these connections, they need to be quick disconnect. Literally, as the rockets are lighting, as the engines are starting, and as they're ramping up to full power, that's when we disconnect the hose. And you can see these rocket launches where you see the space shuttle, as it starts to move, the hoses and things fall away. Those things are literally connected up until the rocket begins to leave the pad. It is literally last second disconnect. And as that rocket starts to move, you need to disconnect right now. You cannot delay. It has to be pow, and that connection just falls away. Well, if you're going to make a connection really high pressure and secure to hold hydrogen, and you want a connection that will just bang, pop off like a cork out of a champagne bottle, those two engineering goals are really quite diametrically opposed. And so we look at that and we say, how do we do that? It's a very difficult thing. So with the STS, the space shuttle, they realized that these quick disconnects were a major problem. And we've now taken this very problematic fueling technology and we've bequeathed it to our 21st century rocket, the Artemis. So what are we talking about? NASA sensors show and allow up to 4% hydrogen gas accumulation around the rocket. Why is that? Because at 6 or 7%, hydrogen becomes explosive in air. So they'll allow up to 4, but if it builds up much over 4, there's a serious danger of a flash fire or an explosion. Hello, Columbia. Hello, Challenger. We've been down that road. It's very dangerous, very expensive, and the cost in human life and material are just horrific. So we have very strict safety standards, as they should do. At the last Artemis launch attempt, it was scrubbed because the sensors were detecting 3 to 5 times higher than the 4% limit. So they were up around 12, 15%. And it's a rocket engine. So there's high voltage electricity, there's fuels, there's ignition sources. not good. So that's why they scrubbed this. And they got the rocket about 11% fueled last time they scrubbed. They were 11% fueled. So if you have a 40-liter tank in your automobile, that would be about a 10-gallon tank. Well, they got about 4 liters or 1 gallon. They were about 10% filled, and they had to say no. They tried to stop the fuel delivery and let the connections warm up in hoping that as they expanded, the connection would tighten, but it didn't work. They didn't self-seal. So, again, why do we use this old technology? At the time Congress authorized Artemis, back in 2010, we're talking about from funding to first time on the launch pad, 12 years. And senators from Florida and Texas led the charge to reuse old rocket components. Current NASA Administrator Bill Nelson was then a U.S. Senator from Florida. He and Kay Bailey Hutchinson of Texas, they said, oh, we're deferring to the experts on the reuse of technology. The experts, many of them friends, had, as we say in the States, skin in the game. They had a financial interest in the companies who were producing the parts. Industry officials who benefited from the contracts to produce hydrogen fueling system, they all said, oh yes, reuse the old components. Yeah. And it's funny, because where automakers would be happy to reuse components from older, cheaper engines, Congress, many of whom support, greener, cleaner engines and systems of transportation, say, oh no, you can't reuse that old stuff. You've got to develop new, more efficient, more functional, safer, new systems. And we won't let you put the old stuff on the road anymore. You can't buy leaded gasoline anymore. A lot of areas are saying you won't even be able to buy an internal combustion engine automobile in another decade or so. And we could talk about that too, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this program. But it's funny, in this instance, they did completely the opposite. They said, oh no, reuse the old stuff. Not everyone supported the idea. Lori Garver, NASA's deputy administrator in 2010, thought it was terrible. And she said, and I'm quoting here, they took a finicky, expensive program that couldn't fly very often. They stacked it together differently, and then they said all of a sudden, now it's going to be cheap and easy. No. Lori Garver referred to the cabal of contractors, NASA officials, and government representatives as, quote, the self-licking ice cream cone. I love that analogy. Lori Garver, my hat is off to you. And friends, this was the 6th launch attempt for Artemis. The Boeing-built rocket was 7 years in design and assembly, more than a year of testing after construction at Boeing's factory in Louisiana. Artemis finally arrived at the Kennedy Space Center more than a year ago, and NASA workers have been assembling and testing the complete rocket since the components arrived in April of 2021. Now, some folks will say, obviously, COVID caused delays here, and I'm not disputing that. I think certainly that had to be a factor, but the system we have here, friends, that has been bequeathed to us by government officials and by self-interested industry magnates just isn't functioning well. So let's, as some folks may recognize the old guy reference here, let's set the Wayback Machine to the late 1960s. How did we originally go to the moon? We did it 50 years ago. How did we do it then? Well, we had the Saturn V, which 50 years on is still the biggest, most powerful rocket ever flown. We've never topped it in size, in thrust, in lifting capacity. It's like this 50-year-old Olympic record that still stands. And when we think about, oh, where are we in automobiles from 50 years ago? Okay, let's think 1972 automobile. Anybody here be happy to purchase a 1972 automobile? Even send your kids to school in one? No, you would not. Think about a 1972 phone. Could you even get a cordless handset in 1972 where the base stayed and you could walk around? Maybe, probably not. Most people didn't have them. Not to mention, did we have cell phones or anything? No, certainly not. Did we have internet in 1972? What did a computer look like in 1972? Could you get one for your home? Yes. It was expensive. You had to put it together yourself. The original Apple II Plus computer didn't come out until about 1976. So in 1972, most of us who were in school back then, we were still using slide rules. We weren't even using electronic calculators. And so the Saturn V, the idea that we haven't bested that, kind of shameful. This rocket was capable, it was flown from 67 to 73. It's capable of lifting 310,000 pounds, that's 140 metric tons, into low Earth orbit. The third stage was considered payload. The Saturn V was actually stages 1 and 2. And the third stage was considered payload, and that's the stage that actually took you from Earth orbit to the moon, what they called Translunar Injection. And this was designed and built by Wernher von Braun, who built rockets for the Nazi regime at the point of a gun, and he defected and escaped when he could, and he came over and said, I'd like to go to America. He became an American citizen, and he built rockets for NASA. And this rocket was designed at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. 15 Saturn V vehicles were built, plus 3 more for ground testing. 13 Saturn V rockets were launched from Kennedy with no loss of crew or payload. Now we're talking Saturn V is a stage 1 or 2. They all worked. They all flew. None of them lost crew members or payload. Never. Now the Apollo 1 fire, but that was in the capsule. That was not the Saturn V. The Saturn V was extraordinarily reliable, 100% reliable, compared to the space shuttle, an average of 1 scrub per launch. This was powered by the Rocketdyne F1 rocket engine. And this thing, built by Rocketdyne Corporation, the most powerful, still, the most powerful single nozzle liquid-fueled rocket engine ever developed and flown. Took 5 of these bad boys to power the Saturn V. Each engine developed 1.5 million pounds of thrust. That's 6.7 million newtons, or a thrust weight equivalent of 680,000 kilograms. And the F1 engine used 3 tons, or if you prefer, 3 metric tons, about the same, 3 tons of fuel per second. Oh, you have kerosene for a heater or a tractor or a lamp, and think about what 3 tons of kerosene or diesel fuel would look like. And they used that much per second on this rocket engine. Crazy. The entire Saturn V launch system, first stage, consumes 15 tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen per second. So that means 3 tons of kerosene and 12 tons of liquid oxygen every second. It's nuts. So how did they pump it that fast? Well, the rocket Fuel was powered by a gas generator, and this, what they called a turbopump, was powered by a smaller rocket. This smaller rocket engine powered a turbine, which generated 55,000 shaft horsepower. That's more than you need to power an aircraft carrier. And they had one of these turbopumps. They had a pair of these turbopumps, one for kerosene, one for oxygen, for each engine, each generating 55,000 shaft horsepower. It's just a crazy, crazy powerful system. And they delivered the 3 tons of fuel per second at a pressure of 125 atmospheres, or if you prefer, 129 bar. The exhaust from the little rocket that powered the generator, that rocket exhaust was cooler than the main flame, and what they did is they channeled this cooler rocket turbine exhaust around the outside, around the inner edge of the rocket nozzle to cool it and protect it from the main rocket exhaust. Excuse me. If you look at some of these images, and you can see them on today's show notes, and you can see this darker curtain of relatively dark gas that's only a few thousand degrees compared to the brilliant yellow-white cone of flame that comes out that's actually powering the Saturn V rocket. So we have 10 turbopumps, each powered by a rocket engine and a turbine, generating 55,000 shaft horsepower. And you're talking about by volume. Each rocket engine is consuming 15,500 gallons or 58,600 liters of rocket RP1 kerosene, that's a super refined kerosene, and 24,811 gallons of LOX. And this is 1955 technology. That's the crazy part. So this is it's 67 years old, and we don't have anything as powerful today. I am reminded of the Romans who looked back on the ancient Greek Empire and people in the Middle Ages who revered the ancient Greeks and said, wow, you know what? They had technology and mathematics that we just don't have today. And there's a lovely picture of the Saturn V under launch, and that Paul put up there for us. Thank you. And you see this enormous jet of flame. And these engines, the rocket exhaust initially came down, and they were channeled into concrete tunnels that were filled with water. And they had an active water cooling system where they were injecting tens of thousands of liters of water per second into this exhaust tunnel to cool the exhaust gases. And you couldn't be closer than 3 miles from a Saturn V launch. And I saw an article, how loud was it? It was about 180 decibels. And you think, oh, that doesn't seem so bad. After all, a modern jet engine is 150 decibels. But you realize every decibel represents, it's a logarithmic scale. Every decibel represents 10 times more sound energy. So when you're talking about going from 150 to 180, that much sonic energy, it's terrific. It's terrific. You're talking about as much sound blast energy as a small nuclear weapon. And it's all channeled in one direction, all at one time. A nuclear weapon or any conventional weapon, it goes bang in all directions at once. But the rocket engine channels all of this energy in one direction at once. And this is not to say that this isn't challenging to do. And you may have heard people say, oh, well, we can't, we've lost the ability to build a Saturn V F1 rocket engine. Yes and no. In fact, the F1 rocket engines, we know there were 15 vehicles built. Each one had 5. So that's, 75 rocket engines. And essentially, back in the day, these are designed with slide rules and blueprints drawn by hand on paper. And they were built one at a time, much of it by hand. And very skilled people welded and fabricated the parts. Most of the people who worked on that system, remember, these were people at the top of their game between 1955 and 65. Most of those people are passed away and are gone now. The few that are alive are in their late 80s and 90s, and they are very elderly and not able to do that work anymore. But we have blueprints for everything we made. We have modern computer-assisted design and manufacturing that they could only dream of then, where it took a skilled master welder with 20 years experience to put these parts together, and a skilled master machinist with 20 years experience to fabricate these parts on a mill and lathe system. We can crank them out from a cam system, and we can have a robotic assembly system weld them together quite easily today. It's not that we couldn't do that. Okay, so this enormous, loud, energetic cloud is forming steam. Certainly, when we burn kerosene with liquid oxygen, we generate a whole lot of water vapor and carbon dioxide. Yes, we do. The same as any kind of a combustion engine. The difference is with a rocket engine, unlike an enclosed system like an internal combustion, where maybe not all the fuel burns, I can guarantee you out of the back of that rocket nozzle, all of that fuel burns. At that temperature and an open environment where it has access to free oxygen, all of that fuel burns. So almost all of it produces water vapor and CO2. So that generates a lot of steam by itself. And NASA, and they still do this today, they have what they call the water curtain fire protection system. And when the rocket engines are ready to ignite, they start, and these are much bigger than fire hoses. These are enormous water pumping systems, start raining a curtain of water, tens of thousands of gallons per second, and they're showering this down so the fiery exhaust gas hits that liquid, that water, and the thermal energy is used, converting that basically ground temperature water into steam. We don't want those superheated 10,000 degree plus exhaust gases going anywhere. That would start fires. All of us know if you're going to boil some potatoes or pasta and you take a big pot of water and you set it on the stove, it takes a long time for that pot of water to boil. You turn on the stove, whether that's electric or gas, and you're like, okay, I got to wait 10 minutes for this little pot of water to boil. Because water has the highest heat capacity pretty much of almost any natural substance. It takes more energy to raise a gram of water by a single degree centigrade than almost any natural substance. 10 times more energy to heat water than it takes to heat aluminum. And so this liquid water being injected, it's really a heat absorption system. Yes, that water is going to boil and flash to steam with the tremendous energy of these rocket exhaust from these rocket engines, but that's also cooling the exhaust gases. And there's a great long tunnel that's concrete, that's full of water, and water is being flooded into there. So as these hot gases pass through, they are boiling that water away, which uses up their heat. So when they finally exit these concrete exhaust gas directing tunnels, the gases are much cooler and they don't just char everything on their way out. So yes, that's a lovely. Do you know about the Ariane engines, which are built here in Munich? Very similar to the F1, but midget-like and smaller. You know, I did not research the Ariane engines. Do you know, are they, if it's like the F1, I'm assuming they're kerosene fueled. And I know the Ariane is really reliable. You don't hear about it scrubbed that often. It's one of these things that just works. And it's the pride of the ESA, and rightly so. And so I'm betting our European friends. I don't know, you know, that's a good thing that I maybe should do some more research, and maybe our audience will do some little bit of research. How many other countries use hydrogen as a fueling system? I don't really know offhand anybody who does. It's just really problematic. If you want, I'm pretty sure SpaceX does not. Every safety briefing warned about the BFRC, which used very toxic nitrogen tetroxide. The BFRC, Mike Wiesner, could you tell us what that is? Break that down for us. Yes, nitrogen tetroxide is, I believe that's an oxidizer, and it's a very, very nasty toxic substance. Oxidizers, liquid oxygen it's dangerous cryogenically, but in terms of its toxicity, yes, oxygen does have a toxicity, friends. Pure oxygen is not good for you. It damages the coronas of your eyes. It's corrosive. SpaceX likes methane. Yes, that's what I thought, but I didn't want to say. Thank you. I have a former student who works for SpaceX, and India uses hydrogen. Okay. That's interesting to know. And hydrogen, it would be interesting to talk to some of their engineers, and if there's a Cynthia, if you know some engineers who would like to come on my program, I would love to have them. Anybody, and I'll see if I can get my my young friend, my former student who now works for SpaceX, maybe he would like to come on our program. But if any of these folks would like to come on and discuss these systems, every fueling system and oxidizer system has its pros and cons. This is true. On the other hand, if we're going to put people on top of a rocket, we need something that's extraordinarily reliable. Safe is a relative term. You have to know if you're climbing on top of a 300-foot tall, 100-meter tall, basically it's all fuel, and it has the same energy yield as a small nuclear weapon, and you're sitting up there and hoping that it burns, it doesn't explode, and all the explosive energy goes in one direction, and you go to the other, and you're going to be launched at 3.5 gravities, and this has enough energy to lift you 100, 200, 300 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. Safe is a relative term. Every astronaut, the men who've flown, the men and women who train today, they all have to have real brass. They have to be really brave people. They're very smart. They have to have great confidence in their technology. You know, rocket technology, when we make mistakes, sometimes we lose cargo, sometimes we lose people. And that's terrible. I always heard the complaint about the shuttle using peroxide, which I thought was the source of the hydrogen. No, Harold, I believe the peroxide was the oxidizer they used. They used peroxide. Now, their solid fuel boosters, that I don't know. And I am not a rocket fuel expert. I am a space exploration enthusiast, but I am not a rocket fuel expert, friends. So I'm simply sharing what I've learned with you. I'm confident. Let's put it this way. The shuttle was being blamed for the ozone hole. Yeah, there are a lot of silly ideas out there. That idea actually, Harold, goes way back to the Saturn V. There were people who protested the early Gemini and Mercury and Apollo launches that they were poking holes in the atmosphere and changing the weather. No. Causing the ozone hole? No. We know that volcanoes inject sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, and those naturally concentrate around the poles, and they cause the ozone hole. So ozone holes come and go and have since forever. Rockets don't particularly cause that. Yes, they are an open combustion system. Yes, they have a substantive carbon footprint. But then again, there are no electrically powered rockets. There may be, at some point, nuclear-powered rockets. Isaac Asimov, among others, Charlie Bonestell, Wernher von Braun hypothesized the idea of a nuclear rocket engine that would use water as a reaction mass. We would have a nuclear pile which would generate the heat, and water would be fed through, turn into superheated dry steam. Steam is a very dense gas, and it would be ejected out the rocket nozzle and use that as a propellant. That's been proposed for years. Ion engines work very nicely, thank you, but they only work when you're out in space. Part of the problem with launching a rocket from the surface of the Earth, friends, is we've got 100 kilometers of atmosphere to punch through. And the atmosphere is very thick for the first 10 kilometers, and so you have what you call max Q, the maximum dynamic pressure. As you're flying through and accelerating, those first 10 kilometers, you've got to overcome a lot of atmospheric drag. All of us, as children, I'm sure, have stuck our hand out a car window and go, oh, look, I can make my hand fly up and down, and we've all done that as kids. And yeah, if you stick your hand out a car window, you see how that's pushed back, and you go, goodness, there's a lot of drag out there. We work as automotive company engineers, work day in and day out to reduce drag. And a lot of modern cars have a flat bottom plate to cut drag, because at 100 kilometers an hour, 50 miles an hour, you know what? Most of your engine power is being used to push air out of the way, overcoming atmospheric drag. So when we're talking about, we need to get going 17,000 kilometers an hour to achieve orbit, gee, guess what? That's a lot of drag we have to overcome. And these rockets don't go straight up. They have to go up and then turn parallel to the Earth's surface. They have to fly up and then downrange. And so this is also an interesting problem. I think we can develop a powerful, safe, and effective rocket engine system for putting people back into space. I think we need to put people back in space. I think we need to put men and women on the moon. I think we need to explore and develop the resources there. I think as marvelous as all our rovers and landers are, Mars exploration will not really take a quantum leap forward until we put boots on the ground. And frankly, friends, I don't believe our governments will ever get us there. I firmly believe that it is private industry that will put colonies on the moon first and put men and women on the surface of Mars first before governments do it, simply because the problem we have with government is we have the self-licking ice cream cone problem. Governments and the people in them are not scientists and engineers, but they're very concerned with who makes money. And a private company like SpaceX or other private ventures that are concerned about making money, they're spending their own money, not somebody else's. That's the other issue. Governments always work spending somebody else's money, and governments don't have to turn a profit. So we put governments in charge, and it's been 50 years since we've gone to the moon. That is our national shame as Americans. And I think that our private citizens worldwide, working with private companies, will really take over and advance far beyond what governments have ever been able to do. And I take nothing away from the good folks at NASA, ESA, JAXA, India's space agency, which I don't know your name or acronym, and the German, the DLR. Don't ask me to say that name, I can't do it. But there are space agencies around the world who are doing marvelous things. But I really think it's our private industry which is going to make us a multi-planet civilization. And you have to think, friends, and I'll wrap up the program with this, every species that has ever been born on this planet has died here. We cannot ensure our perpetuity until we're a multi-planet species. Tsiolkovsky, the great Russian visionary and rocket scientist, said, "The Earth may be the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in the cradle forever." He was right. Goddard was right. Asimov was right. I think Elon Musk is right in my own minor way, and I think I'm right too. I don't think our governments are going to get us there. But I do hope I live long enough to be your faithful narrator and reporter when we put boots on the ground on the moon and Mars again. And until we meet again in the next How Do You Know program, we'll bid you good day. Please make sure you download our show notes and take a look. There's a lot of fun links in there for you. And I'll just throw in one last-minute plug, Star Mentor. Star Mentor has been selling well, so I encourage you to take a look. Don't worry if you take a look on Amazon or your local book dealer says, "Oh no, there's only one left. We'll print more." And please, if you've purchased a copy, if you've read it, if you've looked into it, leave us a review. That's perhaps one of the greatest things you can do to support our program here on the Explore Live Network. Share this, leave a review, leave a comment. And for our books and products, really super important, support us, not just by buying the book or the other products, but leave us a review, because other people depend on you to find these resources which you already have come to enjoy and rely on. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week. Clear skies to you, and we'll see you next time on How Do You Know?